Picture the ending everyone thinks they already know. Flames tearing through miles of shelving in a single afternoon, erasing the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world in one catastrophic blow. It is the most famous library fire in history. And it is not what actually happened. What really destroyed the greatest library ever built took 500 years, not one afternoon, and the true story is far stranger, and far more damning of us, than any single fire. The story begins not with fire, but with ambition. When Alexander the Great founded his namesake city on the Egyptian coast in 331 BC, he dreamed of a capital that would outshine every city on earth. He never lived to see it built, but his general Ptolemy, who seized Egypt after Alexander's death and crowned himself pharaoh, inherited the dream and decided to build something no king had ever attempted, a library meant to hold every book in the world. Not a collection for one city or one king's vanity shelf. Every book, every scroll, every scrap of recorded human knowledge gathered under one roof, in one place, for the first time in history. It was called the Mausoleum, a shrine to the Muses, and the library was only part of it. Attached were dining halls, gardens, an observatory, even a small zoo, all built to support scholars who lived, ate, and worked there at royal expense. The ambition demanded a method nobody had tried before, and the one the Ptolemies chose was, by any modern standard, an act of state-sponsored piracy. Every ship that docked in Alexandria's harbor was searched. Any book on board was seized, copied by royal scribes, and only the copy was returned to its owner. The original stayed in the library. Forever. It was a law with teeth, and it worked exactly as intended. Within decades the library's holdings ran into the hundreds of thousands of scrolls, an almost unimaginable scale for the ancient world. Ptolemy III went even further. He borrowed the official state manuscripts of Athens's three great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, posting an enormous deposit as collateral, and then simply forfeited the deposit and kept the originals. Athens got its money. Alexandria got the only originals of some of the greatest plays ever written. It was theft, dressed as scholarship, and the library grew richer for it with every single ship. But a warehouse of scrolls is not what made Alexandria legendary. What made it legendary is who the Ptolemies invited to read them. Consider Eratosthenes, the library's chief librarian, who used nothing but shadows, a well, and simple geometry to calculate the circumference of the Earth, and came within a few % of the true answer, more than 2,000 years before satellites existed. Consider Euclid, whose textbook on geometry, written and refined in Alexandria's halls, would remain the standard way humanity learned mathematics for the next 2,000 years. Consider Herophilus, who performed systematic human dissections here, some say even on condemned prisoners, and mapped the nervous system and the eye with a precision no one would match for over 1,000 years. And consider Callimachus, the poet-librarian who took on an almost impossible task, cataloguing the entire collection into 120 scrolls of bibliography, an index of everything the ancient world had ever written down. Archimedes himself, the greatest engineer of the ancient world, is said to have studied in Alexandria in his youth, and it was here that he likely learned the water-lifting screw design and the mathematical methods he would later make famous back home in Syracuse. The library's scholars did not just collect old knowledge, they manufactured new knowledge, at a pace and scale the world had never seen concentrated in one place before, feeding each other's work in the same halls, the same gardens, the same long candlelit nights. For roughly 200 years, Alexandria was, without serious rival, the intellectual capital of the entire world. Kings sent their sons to study here. And then, slowly, the trouble began. The Ptolemaic dynasty that had built and funded the library began, generation by generation, to rot from within. Royal murders, sibling marriages, palace purges, the later Ptolemies spent as much energy killing each other as ruling Egypt. One king, Ptolemy VIII, expelled the scholars of Alexandria wholesale during a political purge, scattering some of the library's own trained librarians across the Mediterranean, carrying its methods and its rivalries to other cities. Funding, once lavish, grew unreliable. A library is not a monument, it is a living institution, and a living institution starves the moment its patrons stop paying attention. By the time a Roman general named Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC, chasing his rival Pompey into a civil war that had spilled across the Mediterranean, the library he found was already a diminished version of its old self. Caesar backed one side of an Egyptian royal succession dispute, a young queen named Cleopatra, and found himself besieged inside the palace district by the forces of her rival brother. Trapped and outnumbered on the water, Caesar made a desperate decision. To stop the enemy fleet in the harbor from being used against him, he ordered his own ships, and the docks around them, set on fire. The fire did what fires do at a crowded waterfront. It spread. It jumped from ship to dock to the warehouses that lined the harbor, the very warehouses where the library reportedly stored its overflow of scrolls awaiting copying and cataloging. Ancient writers who mention it, and only a handful do, describe books burning at the docks that night. Not the great library building itself, standing further inland in the royal quarter. The warehouses, the overflow, the unsorted stock. It was a real loss. Uncounted scrolls, possibly tens of thousands, turned to ash in a single chaotic night. But it was not the ending the popular story tells. The Mausoleum itself, the great reading halls, kept functioning for centuries afterward. Ancient sources disagree on exactly how many scrolls burned that night at the docks, with estimates ranging from tens of thousands to a wildly exaggerated 400,000, a number almost certainly inflated by later writers who never set foot in Alexandria. What we can say for certain is narrower and more interesting. Even ancient writers sympathetic to the tragedy never once claimed the Mausoleum itself, the actual library building in the royal quarter, went up in flames that night. So where did the myth of one catastrophic fire that ended everything actually come from? The answer says less about ancient Alexandria than about how legends get built, centuries after the fact, by writers who were never there. Roman biographer Plutarch, writing more than a century after Caesar's fire, mentioned it in passing while telling a completely different story. Later writers, centuries further removed, repeated the detail, and each retelling made the fire sound a little larger, a little more final. By the time 18th century historian Edward Gibbon wrote his sweeping account of Rome's decline, the single dramatic fire had calcified into settled fact, a clean, simple story that was far easier to remember than 5 centuries of slow institutional decay. Simple stories survive. Complicated truths get forgotten, and the truth of what actually killed the Library of Alexandria is one of the most complicated and most human stories in the ancient world. Because after Caesar's fire, the library did not die. It shrank, then recovered, then shrank again, drifting for the next 400 years through the same slow erosion that eventually claims every great institution. When Egypt fell under direct Roman rule after Cleopatra's death, the flow of royal money that had built and sustained the library for 250 years began, gradually, to dry up. Rome had its own libraries to fund, its own scholars to patronize, in its own capital. Alexandria was no longer a royal seat. It was a wealthy but subordinate province, and its great research institution slowly slid down the list of imperial priorities. Some of the finest scholars simply left, drawn to a rival library that had grown up in the Anatolian city of Pergamon, which the later Ptolemies had once tried to sabotage by banning the export of Egyptian papyrus, forcing Pergamon scribes to invent a competing writing material, parchment, from treated animal skin. It is a strange footnote of history. An attempt to starve a rival library of writing material may have accidentally given the world one of its most important inventions. Knowledge, it turns out, finds a way around almost any blockade except neglect. Pergamon's library, built on parchment instead of papyrus, grew into a genuine rival collection of some 200,000 scrolls and skins, and centuries later a Roman general would gift the entire library to Cleopatra herself, as a wedding present, folding a rival's collection back into Alexandria's own. Meanwhile, in Alexandria itself, a second, smaller library had grown up alongside the original, a daughter collection housed inside the Serapeum, the great temple of the god Serapis, built on higher ground above the city. As the original Mausoleum library faded through the early Roman centuries, it was this daughter library at the Serapeum that increasingly carried the torch, becoming, in effect, the Library of Alexandria for a new generation of scholars. But the world outside its walls was changing in ways that had nothing to do with fire or funding, and everything to do with which god the empire now demanded its subjects worship. By the late 4th century AD, the Roman Empire had officially adopted Christianity, and in cities across the empire, including Alexandria, the ancient temples of the old gods became flashpoints of violent religious conflict. In 391 AD, Alexandria's Christian bishop, Theophilus, acting with the backing of an imperial decree ordering pagan temples destroyed, led a crowd against the Serapeum itself, the temple that had, for generations, quietly housed the daughter library. The temple's great statue of Serapis was hacked apart in public, and in the chaos of the temple's fall, whatever scrolls and books still remained inside its library annex were scattered, looted, or destroyed, a second, quieter fire, one no single historian bothered to fully record. No dramatic account survives of scrolls burning that day. Just a temple destroyed, a god statue smashed, and a library that, in the confusion, simply stopped being mentioned by anyone at all. One woman lived through this collapsing world, and became, unintentionally, its final and most tragic symbol. Her name was Hypatia, a brilliant mathematician and astronomer, head of Alexandria's Neoplatonist school, respected by pagans and Christians alike for her teaching, until she became entangled in a bitter political feud between the city's Roman governor and its Christian bishop. In 415 AD, a mob dragged her from her carriage in broad daylight and killed her in the street, a brutal act that most historians view as the symbolic close of Alexandria's 7th century age of open scholarship. After Hypatia, the intellectual world that had produced Eratosthenes and Euclid did not vanish overnight, but it never again gathered the way it once had, in one place, under one royal patron, with one impossible ambition, everything, in one building. Hypatia's own students scattered after her death, some fleeing to Athens, some to Constantinople, carrying fragments of Alexandria's mathematical and astronomical tradition with them the same way earlier generations of librarians had once carried it away during the Ptolemaic purges. The Mausians' name and function faded from the historical record sometime in the 3rd century AD, no single date, no single villain, just a slow administrative silence where a great institution used to be. So what, in the end, did the world actually lose? Here is where honesty matters more than drama, because the truthful answer is, we know less than the myth wants us to believe, and what we do know is still staggering. We do not have a surviving catalogue of the library's full holdings at its peak, so no historian can honestly hand you an exact list of lost titles. Claims of specific named masterpieces destroyed there are, almost always, later invention, not documented fact. What we can say with confidence is broader, and almost as haunting. Ancient literature survived into the modern world through a narrow bottleneck of repeated hand-copying across centuries, and for every work that made it through, we know from citations and references that many more did not. Modern papyrologists have spent over a century piecing together tens of thousands of surviving fragments recovered from Egypt's dry sands, at sites far from Alexandria itself, a slow forensic reconstruction of what an entire literary culture actually contained. Every few years another fragment surfaces, a lost line of Sappho, an unknown speech, a forgotten mathematical proof that the ancient world's written record is still, slowly, being recovered, one scrap of sand-buried papyrus at a time. We have only fragments of Sappho's poetry, once collected in 9 full scrolls at Alexandria. We have only a handful of the dozens of plays Sophocles and Euripides actually wrote. Entire schools of Greek philosophy survive today only as titles quoted by later writers, the books themselves gone. None of that loss requires a single dramatic fire to explain it. It requires only what actually happened: 5 centuries of funding cuts, brain drain, political violence, and the ordinary decay of unread parchment, one slow year after another. That is the real story of Alexandria, and it is, in its way, more unsettling than the version everyone already believes. Because a single fire is an accident, a moment of bad luck that history can shrug off. But a 500-year erosion, driven by shrinking budgets, political purges, religious violence, and simple institutional neglect, is not an accident at all. It is a choice, repeated by different rulers, different administrators, and different crowds, generation after generation, each one deciding, in some small way, that this particular institution was no longer worth protecting. That is the uncomfortable answer to the question everyone actually wants answered when they ask what happened to the Library of Alexandria. It was not murdered in one afternoon. It was allowed to starve, slowly, in plain sight, over 500 years. And it did not die alone. Every civilization since has built its own Alexandrias, in different forms, and every one of them depends, quietly, on whether the next generation decides to keep paying for the lamp oil. In 2002, Egypt opened a new library on the same waterfront, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a deliberate modern echo of the ancient institution, built not as a monument to the past but as a bet that the same ambition could be funded properly this time. The library at Alexandria was not destroyed by ignorance storming its gates in one dramatic night. It was let go, piece by piece, by people who simply stopped noticing it was disappearing. That is the story the popular myth leaves out, and it is the one worth remembering, because it is still happening, quietly, in archives and institutions all over the world, right now.